Let's come back from the break, please. We have reached the 1 o'clock public comment period, and the folks I have who reached out by email to request an opportunity to offer comment were Adrian Sandoval, Juan Garcia, Robert Lewis, Kathy Miller, Marilyn O'Boyle, Tom Williams, and I believe I have another one who reached out on chat, Catherine or Kathleen Mosley. If you did not reach out by email and I did not just call your name, that's fine. I will issue a general invitation to anyone on the platform. If I did not call your name, please reach out by chat. And if you have any troubles with the chat function, please reach out to Pamela Jones at 505-660-4305. Public comment, like all testimony in the board hearings, is taken under oath and is limited to 5 minutes. So let me find Ms. Sandoval. I'm not seeing Ms. Sandoval at the moment. Let me move to Mr. Garcia. And by the way, if anyone who signed up isn't here, I'm happy to take their comment at another time. They need only let me know that they are on the platform. Mr. Garcia, I am unmuting you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, good. And your voice is clear, but I'm hearing feedback of some kind.
I can't hear the feedback. Can you hear me okay?
Okay, so if you would please raise your right hand and do you swear or affirm that you will tell the truth?
Yes.
All right, I'm going to start your 5 minutes right now.
Yes, my name is Juan Garcia, and the reason why I'm calling is because the oil and petroleum industry impacts us favorably because of our utilization of our various vehicles that we use to drive and go to work. Okay, so we work in a small business, and what we try to do is obviously we have to go to different locations to help out with yard cleaning, shrubs, trees, and those kind of things. So the high price of gas, petroleum is obviously impacting us today because we can't charge that much for the work that we do, yet we have to pay for the gas and use of fuel, which is where we are mostly impacted. That's pretty much it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Garcia.
Thank you.
See, now I will move to, sorry, I have to switch between screens here. Robert Lewis. Let me see if Mr. Lewis is on the platform. Let's see. Don't see a Robert Lewis. Let me see if maybe he came in as Bob. Nope, I don't see him under either of those names. Kathy Miller. Let's see if I see a Kathy Miller. No. Marilyn O'Boyle. I did see Marilyn O'Boyle. All right. Ms. O'Boyle, I am unmuting you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Terrific. Would you raise your right hand, please? Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start your 5 minutes right now.
Okay, I actually think it's about 2 minutes, but that's fine. Okay. I'm happy to address the members of the Environmental Improvement Board. My name is Marilyn O'Boyle, and I'm a member of First Unitarian Church of Albuquerque, and I'm the chair of our Environmental Committee. I have 5 grown children and 9 grandchildren, some of them living close by, some in other states. I am very concerned about methane pollution in our state. We all need to work together to correct the huge problem of global climate change. Ozone and methane from wells in our state contribute to this problem. New Mexico is home to some of the worst methane pollution in the country. Oil and gas operators release 1.1 million metric tons of methane through venting, flaring, and leaks. Methane is a powerful greenhouse gas that is 84 times more potent than carbon dioxide in the short term. Our children are disproportionately impacted by pollution from oil and gas operations, including ozone-forming toxins that worsen respiratory diseases and trigger asthma attacks. One of my grandchildren has asthma. Ozone or smog can also worsen emphysema and cause heart disease. These wells have a terrible and immediate effect on the health and well-being of people living close by. There are some federal bills in the works, but we need to support and strengthen our local bills to protect families living close by and also to protect the air and health of everyone long term. This is a moral and ethical issue, and we can no longer delay our responses. New Mexicans are already experiencing severe impacts of climate change, harming our health, air, land, water, and economy. Scientists, NASA, the Department of Defense all agree that climate change is a threat to our kids' future, and we can no longer ignore the increasingly strange and severe weather. As the IPCC report emphasized, this really is code red for the planet. I support strong methane rules and thank the Environmental Improvement Board for this hearing.
Thank you very much, Ms. O'Boyle. And Teresa, the Maryland is the standard spelling. O'Boyle is O''B-O''Y''L''E. Let me move to Mr. Williams in the event he is here. No. Let me see if perhaps Ms. Sandoval has joined us. This takes a moment to scroll through names. No. And let's see, I believe it was Ms. Mosley was the other one. Yes, Kathleen Mosley. Ms. Mosley, I am unmuting you. Can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
Very, very clearly. Thank you. Would you spell your last name, please? Oh, something just happened. A lot of videos cut out there for a moment. I'm sorry, Ms. Mosley, did you speak?
Yes.
Okay.
It's Mosley.
Thank you very much. Would you raise your right hand? Do you swear
Yes,
or affirm to tell the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start your 5 minutes now.
Thank you. I'm a registered nurse and have worked in asthma education in our state, around the state for about 13 years. In 2018, I'm aware that the American Thoracic Society quoted a cost of asthma to our whole country as $80 billion annually, including medical expenses, missed work, school deaths. And that was from a CDC report called The Economic Burden of Asthma in the US from 2008 to 2013, and based on a survey of people with asthma. And our own asthma program has looked at the number of ED visits and hospitalizations. And I know for the report I have here at home on hand, about 7,700 ED visits on the average were calculated to be done in 2010 to 2012, and about 1,800 hospitalizations per year. And I'm very curious listening to the economic modeling about how these costs are figured into the various economic models. And I do know, I'm aware that ozone has increased the number of ED visits from work that was done at UNM in our own state. So I'm wondering how they're looking at weighing those costs, especially as the previous person said, New Mexico releases a large amount of methane, which impacts beyond our state. So that's my question.
All right, thank you, Ms. Mosley. For the moment, it will remain a question hanging in the air, and we'll see if any of the parties would like to address that. And thank you for your comment.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. I'm looking at too many screens. I do not have anyone else reaching out through the chat who indicated a desire to offer public comment at this 1 o'clock session. I am happy to accept public comment at every other 9 o'clock, 1 o'clock, and 5 o'clock public comment session. So thank you for that. And let's return to the technical case. Is anyone else seeing that the videos on everyone except me are?
I'm chatting her. Oh, there she is.
Oh, there. Oh, I'm sorry, Madam Chair. This is now the second time in the last few minutes this has happened. It just everyone's video except mine blanks out, and I'm not sure what's happening.
Yes, Madam Hearing Officer, I think we can see everybody, and I don't know if it's your connection.
Okay, thank you for that. I will say I'm not getting the little box that pops up that says your bandwidth is low or anything, but it's entirely possible. So let me just mention as a last resort, if in fact it's my connection that is bad and the event comes to a stop, I'm very sorry about the inconvenience, but I would do my best to get right back on the platform and would encourage all of you to do the same. And we won't start until we know that we have the folks we need. So I'm not sure what's happening there. All right, let's return to the technical case. Ms. Katz, we need Ms. Day and Mr. Palmer for their questioning.
Yes, Madam Hearing Officer, I see Mr. Palmer. There they are.
All right, and let me turn first to Ms. Fox. Ms. Fox, do you have questions of this panel?
No, Madam Hearing Officer, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Paranos?
Sorry, couldn't find my mute button. No questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. James?
No questions, Madam Hearing Officer.
Thank you. Ms. DeVore? May not be on. Mr. Nykiel?
No questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. DeSalen?
No questions. Thank you. I want to thank both these witnesses for their testimony.
Thank you. Mr. Heiser?
I do have a few questions, Madam Hearing Officer.
All right, go ahead.
So I think I'll start with Mr. Palmer for the first couple of questions and then move to Ms. Day. So I guess I will ask this because Ms. Katz asked this of our expert. Mr. Palmer, you are a consultant, is that correct?
That is correct.
And you're being paid to provide this testimony for Nmbd?
That is correct.
Now, you said that most of the work that you have done as an employee of ERG has been working to support government rulemakings. Is that correct?
That is.
Okay. And are there differences between how the government might collect information to come with cost studies versus how the private sector might have to do it?
I believe there would be.
Okay. And so do you sometimes receive governmental requests for information that are transferred to you in order for you to conduct the analysis that you might do in support of a regulatory analysis?
Yes.
And you also do you also undertake literature surveys of information that's in the published literature to determine costs of certain things like control technologies or control techniques?
Yes.
Okay. And are those often based on anonymized surveys of private information?
It depends on the source.
Okay. When you were preparing the cost that you used sort of as a reference point for your critique of Mr. Dunham's cost in table 7, and you look at the compressor cost in his table, which reports to be $55, is that actually the cost of a compressor change to make the changes required by this rule?
No, not at all.
And so that would suggest that this, go ahead, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you.
I think the average cost of average cost per compressor would be quite a bit more than $55.
So that's probably at some level a cost that's just been taken and then divided on a per well count, apparently.
That's my understanding of table 7.
Okay. And similarly, if we were to look at the cost of retrofitting, say, an engine, you would expect that to be more than the $1,336 that's shown here.
That's correct.
One last question for you. I think you talked that when you did the ERG work for the costs that were done in the department's place, that you looked at the permit database the department had for the number of facilities. Is that correct?
Yes, those data were downloaded from the department's database by department staff and then transferred to, well, they were transferred to us. They were shared with us. Those are the same data that are in the spreadsheets that the department has posted since, I believe, the beginning of June.
Mm-hmm. And can you tell me, Mr. Palmer, whether that's just the permit database or does that include the notice of intent database as well?
It does include facilities that are marked as NOIs or notice of intent.
Great, thank you. I guess that completes my questions for you. I've got a couple questions for Ms. Day, if she's with us as well.
Am.
All right, I'm not seeing you, but there you are. Good afternoon, Ms. Day. Thank you for joining us. In page 2 of your testimony in Rebuttal Exhibit 19, did you agree that even your analysis tended to show an estimated cost potentially as high as about $1.7 billion over 5 years at the bottom of that page?
I believe I did, yes.
Okay. And I believe in the demonstrative exhibit that accompanied you, it showed a 1.2. Was that probably just a clerical error?
I am not aware of that
You may not have
exhibit.
been, yeah, you may not have been able to see it because sometimes if you're presenting, you don't get to see what's on the screen. Okay. But the 1.7 is the number that you are testifying to today, correct?
Let me just clarify that the 1.7 was the a 5-year cost, assuming the ERG estimate of, I believe it was 338 million per year.
I believe that's what you said, yes. Okay, thank you. And then Ms. Day, in evaluating the
Mr. Heiser?
accuracy, yes.
I can address that question as well. Actually, I'm sorry, Ms. Day is actually on travel and in England and has been out of the country since the end of last week. So the difference there is that the costs in the slide that I helped prepare reflect updated costs to reflect changes in the version of the rule that was filed on September 6th. And in particular, there was a big reduction in the cost for engines and turbines, a smaller reduction in cost for storage vessels, and a very, very small change in cost for heaters. The big difference was in the engines and turbines costs. And so there was a slight discrepancy between my preparation of the slides and the testimony. So those updated costs, I believe, will be submitted as exhibits when we do get to those sections. So just to hopefully avoid a lengthy conversation here.
Okay, well, thank you for
Does
that
that help you?
clarification. Yes, thank you, Mr. Palmer, for that clarification. When you did that recalculation of the cost, Mr. Palmer, did you reconsider the administrative costs of the addition of, for example, the annual compliance certification on the administrative side, or did you just look at the capital cost side?
These are the capital and annual operation and maintenance costs is usually what we consider, and in a lot of those the cost inputs that we use, which very often come from pre-existing documents such as the EPA cost analyses, there's very often a line item for administrative and management cost. So, but we did not include a separate line item for the compliance certifications for this rule.
Okay, so it's a sort of a partial update to reflect changes in the rule. Is that a fair characterization?
I think, yes, it's been equipment focused, let's say that.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And then either Mr. Palmer or Ms. Day, because I'm not sure which of you would be better prepared to answer this. Have you looked at any changes in equipment and installation costs that have occurred in the most recent period, say 2020 through 2021? Or are most of your costs based on costs that were developed prior to that period and then inflated to this period?
I can respond to that one. The costs are what we've been using is the chemical engineering plant cost index to I don't want to say the word inflate, to update the cost from when they were originally developed to, in our case, we use 2019, given when we started this project, which was 2020. Do recognize, of course, that the last couple of years have been somewhat extraordinary in terms of the availability of raw materials, et cetera. So we've not attempted at the update this cost to reflect the unusual circumstances of our current situation, if that's what you're implying, sir.
Well, thank you, Mr. Palmer. You saved me having to ask the question. Appreciate that. On Ms. Day, on page 14 of your rebuttal testimony, you stated that given that investments in equipment are typically spread out by affected owners and operators, a more realistic assumption would be that the cost of regulation can be spread out more evenly over the 15-year useful life timeframe. Do you recollect making that statement in your testimony? This is on page 14.
Yes, I do.
Does the Nmbd proposal, with the exception of engines and turbines and pneumatics, provide 15 years to comply with any provision?
I don't think I can answer that question.
Okay, so you're not aware of the time frame for implementation set forth in the proposal in any detail?
Not specifically.
Okay, so how would we know that industry could spread its time over that length of time?
Industry has the ability to obtain financing and spread that financing out. It is my understanding that that can be separate from the time frame of the rule itself.
And do you have any studies or documentation about the prevalence of that practice, or how much of this would be expensed, or the additional cost that would be incurred by trying to finance in that way?
The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, when they do studies when they issue regulations and they do regulatory impact analyses, typically use this assumption when they are estimating the costs to the affected industry, and they are annualizing those costs. This is the time frame that they typically use.
And so, Ms. Day, your position here is based not on anything other than your understanding of EPA practice?
I would say that that is an important part of what informs that thought process on my part.
And okay, I guess I'm not sure what that means, that the EPA practice is what's informing your thought process, or what is informing your thought process?
The standard analytical structure that's used in a regulatory impact analysis by the federal government, by EPA.
And are you aware, if I may represent this, that that EPA standard process, it requires us to treat all capital as having no cost?
I'm not aware of that.
Okay. Does that influence perhaps your thoughts about this?
I don't think I could comment on that at this time.
Okay, thank you. And then Ms. Day, in criticizing Mr. Dunham's job impact analysis, did you offer an alternative job loss analysis in your testimony?
I was not asked to provide that.
So you were just asked to provide a critique of Mr. Dunham's analysis?
I was asked to review. I was asked to review his analysis.
Okay. I believe that's all my questions, Madam Hearing Officer. Thank you, Mr. Palmer. Ms. Day, you were both very helpful.
Thank you, Mr. Heiser. Mr. Rose, do you have questions of this panel?
I do not, Madam Hearing Officer.
Thank you. Mr. Jano?
No questions, Madam Hearing Officer.
Thank you. Mr. Boutier?
Madam Hearing Officer, this is Christina Sheehan. The GCA has no questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sheehan. Ms. Gutierrez?
No questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Colclisher?
No questions, Madam Hearing Officer.
Thank you. And Ms. Witherspoon? Don't hear. Let's move then to the board members for their questions. While I'm doing that, please, if you are on the platform and you are not a panelist, you can indicate that you have a question by reaching out through the chat. Madam Chair, do you have questions of the panel?
Good afternoon, Madam Hearing Officer. Yes, I have a couple of questions. Let me scroll my pages here. I just so that I'm clear, I think it's a follow-up to Mr. Heiser's question, and this would be for either Mr. Palmer or Ms. Day. So you were only asked by Nmbd to review Mr. Dunham's analysis, and is that correct?
Are you referring to all of the work conducted by ERG
Yes.
in total? I can tell you that I also obtained and prepared some data that are used in the small business definition. And provide feedback on Mr. Dunham's analysis, and Mr. Palmer can explain all of the ways that he's involved.
That would be great. Thank you, Mr. Palmer.
I was, among many other things, I was asked to review Mr. Dunham's economic impact analysis.
Thank you for that. And I think my follow-up question is, so was a separate, just so I'm not confused, was there a separate analysis done based upon, I would say, some of the numbers that you were, you know, some of the I guess, readily available data and numbers?
So for each part of the rule that addressed a different emission source type. So for example, engines and turbines, dehydrators, storage tanks, et cetera. I guess there's, 15 different sections of the rule that are specific to a certain type of equipment. We estimated both cost and emission reductions, because an important variable that I think people will talk about is the cost per ton of VOC or NOx reduced. And so that is what we calculated. And then we also did attempt to estimate a total annual cost for the rule going forward.
Thank you for that, Mr. Palmer. And in that estimation, I just want to make sure I'm clear. In one of the slides that was presented, Mr. Dunham's estimate was 3.8 billion. And then ERG, as you said, there was a difference in what Ms. Day was referencing. Day's slide, you estimated 215 million per year.
That is correct.
Over 5 years, and that would be no more than 1.1 billion. Is that correct? And
yes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Palmer. And that cost, is that industry cost, or is that cost to the state of New Mexico in terms of
that is the expected in the $215 million is the expected annual cost to the industry in terms of the annualized capital cost of either retrofitting equipment or buying control devices, and then also an annual estimate of operation and maintenance cost.
Is there included in that cost, just so I'm clear, is that additional, Mr. Dunham's analysis looking at additional administrative costs related to some of the reporting requirements that are being
there's not we did not do a separate cost. However, very often within those cost estimates that we began with, there is very often a line item for administrative and management costs. Excuse me, I'm just going to shut this other door.
Okay. Were you going to add more, Mr. Palmer?
No, there's no, as I said, the cost estimates that we start with, which very often come from a federal regulatory project, for example, they often include a line item for administrative and management costs within those cost estimates.
Thank you, Mr. Dunham. And so I think was referenced earlier in the verbal testimony before lunch he had shared that ERG works with other governments in terms of other regulations and rules and costs analysis related to those other regulations and rules. And could you share with us how many states you've provided analysis for?
Could you restate the question? I'm not
I'm
sure
just
what your
wondering.
question is.
Yeah, I apologize, Mr. Palmer. I'm just wondering how many states, and if you can't give a specific number, is it like less than 10, more than 10?
I have worked on, in the last 30 years, I have worked on regulatory projects, probably covering somewhere between 15 and 20 different source categories. As a company, we've been supporting the federal EPA's Clean Air Act regulatory development for 40 years. We've supported the EPA in developing emission standards for more source categories than I could count. I mean, I've personally worked on secondary lead smelting, municipal waste combustion, fiberglass boat manufacturing, oil and gas, numerous surface coating source categories, controls as a part of enforcement actions for automobile shredders. So yeah, I'm not sure whether you're asking for the breadth of our experience or whether we've done oil and gas cost estimates for other states.
Yes, it's the oil and gas cost.
No, I don't think we have.
Okay, that's what I wanted to.
And I have not personally.
Okay, what about you, Ms. Day?
Sorry about that. I have not worked on oil and gas estimates for other states.
Okay, thank you so much for that. I appreciate your time and both your testimony. And thank you so much, Madam Hearing Officer. Those are the questions I have for now.
Thank you very much. Vice Chair Trujillo Davis, do you have questions of this panel?
Yes, I only have a couple. They're just clarifications. And I apologize, is it Mr. Palmer? I was curious, in your scope from Nmbd, did you receive any instructions to do a job impact analysis or a cost impact analysis to the state as far as lost revenue or lost jobs?
We were not.
Okay. So I guess my next question is probably for Ms. Pat. Does that information exist in one of the exhibits somewhere that we could look at or reference?
Member Trujillo Davis, the only information that was provided by the department is all in the cost estimates, and that was the information that the department provided consistent with the requirements of the statute.
Okay, so just to be clear, there's no impact for jobs and no impact to the state?
Correct. There was no, yeah, that type of, we did not have that type of economic analysis. We
Okay.
simply, we provided the costs and emissions reductions estimates.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I may have more questions later, but I'm done for now. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Member Cates?
Yeah, Chair Sweeney and Member Trujillo Davis kind of brought up some stuff I was wondering about, and it's been covered. But generally, then Mr. Palmer and Ms. Day, then my question is goes to your critique of the study presented by the gentleman this morning, whose name I'm forgetting. I'm sorry. But your direction to us, if I understand you, was to not take it too seriously. Some of the estimates and the numbers that we saw in that testimony. Is that a fair characterization?
Yes, that's what I stated in my testimony this morning.
Would it be going too far to say that report and that testimony we heard this morning is just perhaps a piece of alarmist fiction? Would you go that far?
I would not say that. I would just say that it was not well documented where the cost came from and how the analysis was created.
So it's thin. It's pretty lightweight stuff. Is that fair to say? I suppose I'm putting words in your mouth, but I'm just trying to really just kind of get down to the grit of it.
I cannot answer beyond the information that we had to evaluate.
Okay, yeah, that's all I have. Thanks, sir.
Thank you. Member Bitzer.
Couple of things. When I heard clarification about the $1.7 billion figure over 5 years versus the 1.1, and then because originally in the verbal testimony I heard 1.7, but I saw 1.1, and that reconciled, it seemed to me, with the annual, the 200 some million versus the 300 million. We're settling on the 1.1 billion now, or the 1.7 billion?
We estimate that the cost over 5 years would be 1.1 billion.
Okay, so yeah, I misunderstood the explanation about who had done what. And when you said when Ms. Day was in England, I thought maybe we had a pounds to dollars conversion or something going on there. And that's like, well, that would make it even worse because the pound is still above the dollar, I think. So for New Mexico specifically, if you happen to know, I guess the discrepancy between the two reports is larger in terms of the number of wells in the natural gas realm than it is in the oil realm. It's like is a well, or is one type of well typically a larger economic footprint than the other? Is a natural gas well a bigger deal than an oil well, or is an oil well a bigger deal than a natural gas well in New Mexico, do you suppose?
I don't believe I could answer that question for you.
And I don't believe I could either.
Industry may at some later point have an answer for me on that, or a suggestion. I thought I read that into their into earlier testimony and data about because it seems to me there was a big discrepancy in the natural gas well count and not so big in the oil count. If oil wells are minor compared to natural gas wells, then that would just exacerbate the gap, and vice versa. Anyway, that's all I have.
Thank you. Member Garcia.
Officer. Yes, thank you. So let's see, Mr. Palmer, I do have a question for either one of you, I guess. You did make the statement that the board should give no weight to Dunham's estimates. That's a pretty strong statement. And I understand part of it is because they overstated number of wells, et cetera. You identified some of the misleading numbers that they were using. And then you also noted that there were a lot of assumptions you just don't know about. Because they didn't give any detail about the model, the assumptions in the model, the input data for the model, et cetera. So if you had that information, and you understood better how he came up with those numbers, would it be possible that you could accept some of the information that he provided?
I think that would be fair, yes.
Okay, so so let me ask you again, when you say the board should give no weight to Mr. Dunham's estimates, you mean absolutely nothing in his report should we pay attention to? It's all garbage.
There were no data provided except the cost numbers in table 7, and no explanation of where those data came from and how they were generated, how they relate to cost estimates that have already been provided from the department, and then the model that extrapolates from those cost data to those employment figures that he has and the change in tax revenue. So there's no linkage between those explained to the board. And so we don't know if those, I can't, I mean, just based on the inputs that are in table 7, which don't line up with ERG's cost estimates on individual items or the total. And then I'm not an economic modeler, but there is no connection. There's no clear path or mechanism between those costs in table 7 to the economic impacts that he puts out in table, which table was it? In table 11 or 12. So I mean, that's all I can say is that there's, given the uncertainty in the inputs for table 7, we don't know whether you could, what to do with the outputs that are in the later tables. That's all I can say.
Thank you. That's all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Garcia. Member Honker?
Yeah, just one question for Mr. Palmer, I believe. When you were talking about having done your recent recalculation of costs based on the most recent edits to the proposed rule that Nmbd did. And it seemed like when you were questioned about materials costs, I think from the NMOGA Council, I believe you said your materials costs were based on 2019 data. Do I recall that correctly?
Thank you for the question. What I did was our cost inputs, our cost methodologies were often taken from previously completed EPA cost estimates. And those were done in earlier years. And then we started this project in 2020, and we scaled those numbers up from those earlier years to 2019 using the Chemical Engineering Plant Cost Index. And then the comment was about the supply side issues that we're having right now related to the pandemic, I believe. And so we did not attempt to correct those. I think that would be an interesting but difficult analysis. Things are changing quickly.
Well, I can see where it would be difficult to project that out over years, not knowing what the market's going to do. But it does sound like it sounds like there's a potential that your 1.1 billion number is on the low side if indeed supply costs and even labor costs have gone up over the last couple of years. Is that a fair statement?
I think so, but I think also to take into account that many parts of the rule have fairly extended compliance timelines. And so it's not it's not like the rule will be final in 2022 and everybody needs to be in compliance with everything at the end of 2023. There are extended compliance timelines here. And so, so who knows where things will be in another 2 or 3 years, let's say. So the engines have it's a big issue, obviously. That has an extended compliance timeline. The pneumatics, that has an extended compliance timeline. Some other parts of the rule have extended compliance timelines as well. So that just recognizing that you can't do everything at once. It's not like you can switch it, flip a switch and everybody goes from one thing to another, and that there are supply chain issues. There's technical expertise issues. So that can be taken into account in trying to estimate the total cost, which is, I think, another thing about the, which sort of goes back to the question of what sort of time frame are you looking at, in that those costs are spread out over time and not happening all at once, so by, New Year's Eve 2023, everybody has to be in compliance. That's not the case at all. So.
Understood. Thank you, Mr. Palmer. Those are the only questions I have.
Thank you, Member Hunker. I have a question from the chat from Antoinette Reyes, and then we'll go back to Madam Chair. And I'm sorry, because of the platform, Mr. Palmer, it's not possible for me to have asked the question when she was typing it in. But it was an earlier question. It might have been during Member Garcia's question, might have been relevant then. Is it helpful to think about the fact that natural gas wells are more common in the San Juan Basin, whereas oil wells are more common in the Permian Basin? Is that helpful to any of your discussion here?
It's something that we're certainly aware of, and in some cases we estimated costs separately for the San Juan versus the Permian. For example, for the pneumatics, there are separate cost estimates for Permian versus San Juan. So,
okay, thank you.
Those differences.
Would you repeat that last bit?
I'm sorry, we're aware of those differences.
Okay, thank you. And now, Madam Chair, if you would.
Officer, I have just a few more questions. So back to the slides that were presented earlier. Slide number 3, Mr. Dunham's estimate, and I apologize if we've already addressed this or if you've already addressed this, but we're looking at $3.8 billion in 2020 dollars over a 5-year period. In the in your, I guess, comments regarding Mr. Dunham's estimate, that 5-year period, you had mentioned that you wanted to take it out over greater than 5-year period of time. And were you looking at 15, I think is what was said earlier? Is that correct?
Yes.
Do you want me to handle this, Susan?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. In estimating costs in our federal regulatory programs, usually they use a 10 to 15 year timeline because the equipment is usually quite durable. So the equipment will last 10 to 15, 20 years. And so you usually annualize those costs over a reasonable economic life of the equipment. So you're not assuming and that's the standard practice for estimating equipment costs. And Susan is an economist, and she can explain probably better the rationale for that. But it is standard procedure to estimate costs over the lifetime of the equipment, which is usually 10 to 20 years. And you can sort of think about this a little bit in your own personal life, and that, very few people buy a car with cash, for example, and that you're usually financing it. So, but Susan can address that, the economics behind that maybe a little better than I can, but that's just the standard practice for estimating costs in federal regulatory programs.
Ms. Day, do you have anything to add to Mr. Palmer?
Actually, in general, I think that the way that Brian just explained that is appropriate. It's the point is that the equipment has a certain life, and in this case, that we believe that's 10 to 20 years with an average of 15 years, and so to appropriately reflect the cost that industry will incur on an annualized basis, you would calculate that value over a longer time frame than 5 years. You calculate it over more like 15 years.
And thank you for that. So in the slide, it says that it was ERG's estimate at 215 million per year over a period of 5 years. So if you extend that period more than 5 years, would that mean more costs? Or would it be just the 1.1 billion annualized over 15 years?
Brian, the 215 is per year.
Correct.
Right? And the 1.1 is the annualized total of over 5 years, and that was that estimate was developed to compare to Mr. Dunham's 5-year period.
That's correct. Yes. Right. So that is not the total. That's not the total capital cost of all the of the rule, but that is the annualized cost over 5 years.
Okay, so with the ERG model, it would be more because you were looking at 15 years? Or no?
It depends on what.
And I apologize, I'm just trying to get my head around so I can compare apples to apples or oranges to oranges.
Exactly, right.
That's my only intent in asking.
Yeah, and that was our intent, was that, we, because we were presented with Mr. Dunham's cost estimate over 5 years, we provided our cost estimate over 5 years. And yeah, so we were trying to present a 5-year cost estimate for the rule.
Okay, that clarification is helpful. And I think in Mr. Dunham's report, and I'm trying to find it here, trying to scroll through here, there was a sentence saying the 3.8 billion cost would be, I think 3.2 billion would be realized within the first year. I think it is what it said. I'm trying to find that that sentence here. Do you recall that in the report?
Yes.
And can you explain what your thoughts are regarding that sentence and having, the 3.8 billion, but then noting in his statement that there's 3.2 billion would be realized within the first year?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Maybe I should frame it this way. Do you have an opinion over with that statement that 3.2 billion would be the cost to industry the very first year?
Yes, and I think that's what I was, that's a part of what my testimony was trying to get at, and also when I pointed out that Ms. Lackner from EDF was talking about the fact that there's a phase in. And Mr. Palmer also brought this up, that you don't have to, that industry will not have to incur all of the cost. They won't have to do everything in the first year. And so it doesn't seem correct to assume that the vast majority of the costs will be incurred in that first year, when they have, industry has both the ability to phase in their compliance activities, and they have the ability to finance what they're doing over a longer time frame.
Thank you, Ms. Day. I appreciate that explanation. Madam Hearing Officer, those are all my questions.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. Before we release the panel, Mr. Jano has changed his mind and would like to ask some questions. Mr. Jano, can you join us? There you are.
I'm here, Madam Hearing Officer. Thank you. These are directed to Mr. Palmer. Mr. Palmer, you previously testified that you have not provided testimony in connection with any oil and gas rulemakings, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and you have no other experience in the oil and gas field, do you, sir?
I worked on the greenhouse gas reporting program, subpart W.
Okay, but you have no experience in retrofitting oil field sites, do you, sir?
No, I'm not an engineer.
Okay, no experience on emission control requirements as opposed to, say, the greenhouse gas reporting in the oil field?
What is your question exactly?
Sure, I just want to make sure, sir, you mentioned that you had worked on the greenhouse gas reporting rules in connection with the oil and the oil and gas industry. I just want to make sure you haven't worked on any prior work in which there were actual emission controls being proposed in the oil and gas industry.
No, this is my first rule.
Got it. And sir, you did not independently study how long it will take industry to come into compliance with these rules, did you?
That was not that was not a question we were directed to ask. However, I'd like to point out that the rule does include extended compliance timelines.
Okay, but you, understanding that there are timelines in the rules, sir, you have no opinion on how long it will actually take for industry to meet those timelines, do you, sir?
I will note that in their testimony and rebuttal that industry did recommend changes to the rule specifically related to timelines, and that the rule, to the best of my knowledge, has incorporated those timelines in many cases.
Okay, Mr. Palmer, my question was a little simpler than that. You don't have an opinion on how long it will actually take to retrofit these sites, do you, sir?
No, I don't have an opinion on that.
Are there any 10-year compliance deadlines in the rule package as it's presented right now?
I don't believe there are.
Are there any 15-year timelines, sir?
No.
How about 20-year timelines?
No.
Thank you. No further questions.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Jano. Ms. Katz, has any of the questioning raised in you the need to do some redirect?
Yes, Madam Hearing Officer, I have a few questions.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Ms. Katz, Vice Chair Trujillo Davis has just popped up in the chat. Vice Chair, there you are.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Palmer, I just wanted to follow up on a couple of questions from previous questions. When you were talking about the annualized cost, and you extended it over 15 years, and there was another, it's been mentioned several times about industry being able to secure financing to spread that out. Wouldn't that increase the estimated cost that was put into the report?
The, when we annualize the cost, we include an interest rate. So that does account for financing.
Okay, so was that, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the exact number. It was 1 point something billion. Can you help me out here?
1.1 billion.
Yes, thank you. 1.1 billion. So
Over
does
5
that
years.
that's over 5 years? Okay,
No, that's
so
I'm sorry. It's 215 million is the annualized cost. That over the first 5 years, 5.5 times 215 million is 1.1 billion.
Okay. All right. Thank you for clearing that up for me. I appreciate that.
All right, thank you. Ms. Katz, we're back to you.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. Mr. Palmer, you are not the only person from ERG that worked on this rulemaking, is that correct?
That is correct.
And you had other colleagues from ERG who worked extensively on this this regulation.
That is correct.
Estimates.
Yeah.
And can you discuss their background, if any of them have background in oil and regulatory efforts for the oil and gas industry, emissions controls, and the various types of areas that were identified by Mr. Janot just a moment ago?
Yes, some of the staff members that have been working on this project, developing control and cost estimates, have specialized experience in developing emission inventories for oil and gas, and also on both the upstream side and for Alaska, Texas, TCEQ. They've also been working on developing EPA training in the oil and gas industry. Also working on the North Slope for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, offshore and onshore. Developing the federal implementation plan for Indian country in oil and gas. Worked for Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation on permitting in oil and gas. Worked on the City of Fort Worth study. Other folks who have also worked on Subpart W as well. So as an institution, organization, we do have experience in the oil and gas industry as well.
Thank you, Mr. Palmer. And I will provide resumes of other members of the ERG team. I will provide exhibits for those. Let me see. And you alluded to this, but Mr. Janot was asking you about the timelines for compliance and whether you had any basis for those. Would you agree that that the department has adopted many of the proposals from industry, including Oxy, on those types of provisions?
Yes, that's correct.
And would it be safe to assume that the industry proposing those would believe that they were valid and have the experience to validate those that they were proposing?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. You stated that you relied on EPA's estimates as the basis for the cost estimates for this rule. Is that correct?
Yes, that is true for many of them.
And do those EPA estimates include administrative costs such as record keeping?
Very often it's a line item.
So if owners and operators, Mr. Heiser asked you about whether you evaluated additional administrative costs from the annual compliance certification proposal. If owners and operators comply with the record keeping requirements that are proposed in the rule, would you expect additional resources to be needed to conduct the annual compliance certifications?
If they're performing the record keeping and reporting, the record keeping that's required by the rule, then the compliance certification should be very, very minimal as an extra effort.
Thank you. Would and there were some issues about looking at the 5 years versus the 15 years. Is the total capital cost the same whether you're looking at 5 years or 15 years?
It's the same, yes.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
All right, thank you very much, Ms. Katz. If there's no reason not to excuse the panel, Mr. Palmer.
Sorry, Madam Chair, Madam Hearing Officer, there is reason not to excuse the witness.
Who's this? Oh,
This
Mr.
is Eric Heiser, counsel for Nemoga.
Yes, what is your?
The last, I must take exception to the last question and answer by Mr. Palmer because I think it's misleading. And I think that we should ask him to clarify exactly what he meant by it.
Oh, all right. Mr. Palmer, do you have a clarification? We can't hear you.
And I would be happy to explain what my concern is about that if it would be helpful. Right. So,
yes, could you please?
Please go ahead,
okay.
Mr. Heiser.
So the question that was asked by Ms. Katz was, is the total compliance cost of the rule the same as the 5-year annualized
That is
cost?
not what I asked.
No.
Okay, then what was the question? Because maybe I misheard it.
The total capital cost.
So, Mr. Palmer, do you agree that the total capital cost was recaptured in the first 5 years of the 15-year period that it appears you and Ms. Day used?
I'm sorry, can you please restate that?
Do you believe
Just repeat it.
Do you believe that the total capital cost is recaptured in the 5 years of the 15-year period that you and Ms. Day say you used?
What do you mean by recaptured?
I believe, and maybe Ms. Katz can clarify, that she was asking whether the total capital cost had been incurred and paid for in those first 5 years.
No. She asked, is the total capital cost the same whether it's spread out over 5 years or whether it's spread out over 15 years?
Ah, okay.
And the capital cost would be the same. You might have a slightly higher financing cost, but the capital cost is the capital cost.
But you've not ever said what you think the total capital cost is over the 15-year period.
I have not presented that, no. And I'm not prepared to present that right now.
Okay.
I don't have any additional questions, Madam Hearing Officer.
All right, thank you, Mr. Heiser. Member Garcia, you have another question.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. One more question for Mr. Palmer that came to mind is, I would anticipate that there's always going to be discrepancies between industry cost estimates and regulatory entities' cost estimates. That's just the way it is. Because you have so much experience in working with rulemaking with EPA, for instance, are there efforts to reconcile the differences that there are with industry in terms of how you look at the cost and they're so different? Could you talk about that a little bit?
See, I'm not. I can talk about that a little bit, yes. The EPA cost estimation methods used in regulatory development, the EPA cost manual generally recognizes that their estimates are within plus or minus 20 or 30%. those methods are based on information that they collect from industry, and they are updated periodically over time. So EPA, for example, just updated their cost methodology for thermal oxidizers. And it goes through, it's almost a regulatory development process where they propose a methodology and take public comment on it. So that's what we rely on mostly. And so there is a discrepancy between industry and regulatory agencies very often. And for example, the EPA is always trying to update their methodology. So that's all I think I can say about that.
Helpful. Thank you, sir. That's all I have. Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer.
Thank you, Member Garcia. Is there any reason not to excuse the panel at this point? Ms. Katz, no follow-up?
No, though they will stick around for the server rebuttal.
Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to excuse them entirely. All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Palmer and Ms. Day. We will get back to you as soon as we can.
Thank you.
So, are we hearing now from witness Lackner? Is that where we're going? Okay. Ms. Paranos, I see you on screen. And can we get Ms. Did I make Ms. Lackner? I think I did, a panelist, right?
I don't see her at the moment. I know she's been following this.
Tell me the first name. I'm sorry, that's how they alphabetize this.
Sure, it's Maureen.
Maureen, yeah.
She says
there.
She
Okay.
said she can't unmute. Okay.
I'll make her a panelist again.
Okay, great.
Oh, there.
Can you hear me?
Yes, and we can see you.
Great.
Super.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. Maureen, if you could please state your name. Floyd.
I am an economics and policy manager in the Office of the Chief Economist at Environmental Defense Fund.
And what is your educational background?
I earned a master's in public policy from the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan in 2017.
Thank you. And can you please give us an overview of your work experience?
Sure. For the past 4 years, I have provided analysis on climate and environmental issues with a special focus on methane emissions from the oil and gas sector. My work on this issue includes economic analyses on proposed regulations and policy design, as well as modeling to track global policy ambitions and abatement opportunities.
And is EDF's exhibit FFF an accurate copy of your CV?
Yes.
And did you submit rebuttal testimony on behalf of EDF on this matter?
Correct.
And is EDF exhibit EEE an accurate version of your rebuttal testimony?
Yes, it is.
Do you have any corrections to your rebuttal testimony?
No.
And are EDF exhibits GGG, III, and HHH exhibits you will be discussing today?
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Lackner, can you please summarize the opinions in your testimony?
Yes. First, the memo prepared by John Dunham to the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association, the JDA analysis, makes several assumptions that lead to an overestimate of the additional operational costs imposed by the rules. Second, as has already been discussed today, the memo omits social costs imposed by the industry. EDF's conservative estimate of the social cost from methane emissions related to New Mexico's oil and gas production amounts to roughly $1.6 billion. EDF also estimates volatile organic compounds emitted from oil and gas facilities was 337,500 metric tons in 2019. Exposure to these emissions are associated with health damages. Third, the memo does not adequately explain assumptions. I believe Ms. Day and Mr. Palmer also noted this in their testimony. It also does not test the strength of the assumptions in any kind of sensitivity analysis used in the model. The lack of transparency in the model calls into question the accuracy and reliability of its conclusions.
Thank you, Ms. Lackner. And can you please discuss the assumptions made in the Dunham memo that led to an overestimate of the additional operational costs imposed by the proposed rules?
Yeah, happy to. Most of these have already been covered, but happy to go through my review. So as I stated in my rebuttal testimony, there are at least 3 assumptions that are not correct and lead to an overestimate of compliance costs imposed by the draft Nmbd rules. First, the analysis assumes that close to 82,000 wells will be impacted by the rules. But in contrast, EDF estimates the Nmbd proposal would require only a little over 49,000 wells to install controls. Our estimate is based on the 54,000 active wells with production in 2019. And I believe this is pretty close to the estimate that Mr. Powell submitted earlier today. In addition to limiting to active wells, the lower number also reflects that not all counties are covered by the rule, and about 4,500 wells within these impacted counties would be exempt from many of the control requirements in the rules pursuant to the small business exemption. Assuming the added administrative and operational costs per oil and gas well listed in the JDA analysis are correct, decreasing just the number of wells, of oil and gas wells covered by the rules results in an adjusted cost to the industry of about 1.8 billion in the first year. This is 43% lower than the figure reported in the JDA analysis. Again, as has been noted several times, this estimate may also be incorrect. The cost data are not documented, and we've already covered this. They disclose results from just 10 companies. A second assumption that we believe incorrectly increases the overall cost is that operators will invest in every requirement under the rule within the first year. Ms. Day and Mr. Palmer also noted this in their testimony. However, this is not the case, as several components of the rule allow for delayed compliance. The May 2021 draft rule that was the subject of the JDA analysis allowed for delayed implementation of a number of provisions. Specifically, the May proposal allowed operators up to 7 years, so until January 1st of 2029, to phase in control requirements for existing natural gas-fired spark ignition engines, 2 years from the effective date of the rule to phase in requirements for existing compressors, 2 years from the effective date of the rule to control existing glycol dehydrators, 1 year to control existing heaters, 1 year to phase in requirements for new and existing hydrocarbon liquid transfers, 3 years to control existing pneumatic pumps, 3 years to control existing storage tanks with the potential to emit between 2 and 10 tons per year of volatile organic compounds, 1 year to control existing storage tanks with a potential to emit of greater than 10 tons per year of volatile organic compounds, and a phase-in of over 8 years to retrofit existing pneumatic controllers. So in other words, operators do have flexibility on a number of these points in terms of how they invest over a period of years. Finally, the analysis does not factor in the additional revenues producers could realize from captured gas. EDF estimates that New Mexico producers waste about $300 million worth of natural gas per year. This is based on an assumption of $4 per 1,000 cubic feet of natural gas, and that natural gas is 80% methane. And EDF's estimate that oil and gas facilities were responsible for over 1 million metric tons of methane emissions in 2019. Investment in equipment that reduces these emissions could result in meaningful savings to industry.
Thank you, Ms. Lackner. And can you explain what the social costs imposed by pollution emitted from oil and gas operations are?
Yes, happy to. Social costs include climate damages from greenhouse gas emissions, such as CO2 when oil and gas are combusted, and climate damages from methane emissions that occur throughout the oil and gas supply chain. And so again, using a conservative estimate of methane climate damages, the social cost from methane emissions related to New Mexico's oil and gas production amounts to roughly $1.6 billion. I'll also note that social costs are not just limited to climate damages. Social costs also include costs to the people of New Mexico who would be exposed to unhealthy air as a result of oil and gas activities. And the analysis should account for local environmental damages incurred in New Mexico through degraded air quality and related health impacts associated with VOC emissions. EDF, again, I'll note that EDF estimates these emissions were over 300,000 metric tons in 2019.
Thank you. Did the Dunham memo account for climate damages and local environmental damages caused by pollution emitted by oil and gas operations?
No, it did not.
Thank you. And do you have any other concerns with the model used by Mr. Dunham?
Yes, as I indicated in my rebuttal testimony, the Dunham report estimates the indirect and induced economic impacts of the rule based on a model developed for Western Energy Alliance. The study does not adequately explain its underlying assumptions or test the strength of these assumptions in any kind of sensitivity analysis. One assumption that appears to be in place is that the rule will not create any jobs. However, this is likely incorrect. Research prepared by Datu Research on behalf of EDF finds that the methane mitigation industry is a young but fast-growing source of high-quality jobs across the country. These companies anticipate hiring more employees if additional methane regulations are put in place at the state or federal level. And based on this research report, in my opinion, the Dunham report overestimates job losses that could stem from the implementation of the Nmbd rules.
Thank you, Ms. Lackner. And did you review the rebuttal testimony submitted by Ms. Day and Mr. Palmer?
Yes.
And do you agree with the opinions provided by Ms. Day and Mr. Palmer with respect to the weight that this board should give the Dunham analysis?
Yes, I agree, and also urge the board to give the Dunham report no weight.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Ms. Lackner. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Paranos. Ms. Katz, do you have questions of Ms. Lackner?
No questions.
Thank you. Ms. Fox?
Just a couple, Madam Hearing Officer. Good afternoon, Ms. Lackner. My name is Tanis Fox, and I represent a number of groups here today at the proceeding. I just have a few questions for you. From your testimony, I take it that you have reviewed Brandon Powell's rebuttal testimony provided on behalf of Nmbd in Rebuttal Exhibit 17. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Can you summarize what Mr. Powell said about the number of wells in New Mexico that will be subject to Nmbd's rule?
Yes, Mr. Powell states that there are currently about 53,000 active wells in active oil and gas wells in the state. 26,800 of these are active oil wells, and about 26,500 are active gas wells. These figures are based on the Oil of Conservation Division's own records.
Approximately how many of those wells will be subject to the EIB rule passed in this proceeding?
My understanding is that the rule would impact most of those active wells.
And how does Mr. Powell's estimate compare with the number of wells estimated in the Dunham report that would be impacted by the EIB's rule?
Yeah, the Dunham report states that the total number of impacted wells is about 82,000. So this is quite a bit lower.
And so what kind of impact would using OCD's estimate of well count have on the Dunham report if the OCD well count were used?
As I stated in my testimony, simply decreasing the total well count will decrease the aggregate cost to the industry.
Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you. Mr. James, do you have any questions of Ms. Lackner?
No questions at this time, Madam Hearing Officer.
Thank you. Lisa DeVore may not be with us. Mr. Nykiel?
No questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. DeSalen?
No questions. Thank you. I thank the witness for her testimony.
Thank you. Mr. Heiser?
Madam Hearing Officer, I would have a few, I think 2 questions for Ms. Lackner. Ms. Lackner, my name is Eric Heiser. I represent the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association. Appreciate your testimony. You made a discussion in your testimony about the fact that the rule currently provides a number of compliance timeframes, generally ranging from 2 to 3 years, with longer timeframes, I think, for pneumatics and engines and turbines. Don't all of those extended compliance timeframes come from the 9/7 or 9/16 draft of the rule, whereas Mr. Dunham's report was based on the May rule, which did not have those timeframes?
No, I believe they did come from the May draft. I checked that.
You did. All right. And do you agree that regardless of whether we pay for it over a 1-year, 5-year, or 15-year time frame, that ultimately the cost of the rule has to be paid for? It just is a matter perhaps of some discount rate.
Well, so starting from the assumption that the costs are accurate, which is difficult to verify, yes, if you have a longer time frame, it is the same cost spread out over a longer time, but that could make a big difference in terms of how you offset those costs with your ongoing revenue and things like that.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Lackner. No further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Heiser. Mr. Rose, do you have questions of Ms. Lackner?
Madam Hearing Officer, I noted that earlier that I had raised objections to a number of the exhibits that Ms. Lackner referred to, as well as portions of her pre-filed written testimony. I noticed that there was no offer for admission of those exhibits. So I was wondering if we should take that up now, whether we should do that at some later date, subject to my objection, or however you wanted to deal with that. We could certainly do that now, and I didn't know, for example, if Ms. Day is going to be available much longer, if Ms. Katz has to.
Right. So I understand, my understanding from our discussion yesterday was that in order to be most humane to Ms. Day, we were going to take up the discussion of exhibits after this topic and the next topic.
I just wanted to make it clear for the record, Madam Hearing Officer, that we still have those objections to those exhibits.
Yes, thank you for putting that on the record. That's perfectly fine.
Otherwise, I have no questions of this witness, Madam Hearing Officer.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Rose. Mr. Jano, do you have questions of Ms. Lackner?
No questions, Madam Hearing Officer.
All right, Mr. Boutier.
No questions, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gutierrez.
No questions.
Thank you, Mr. Colclasher.
No questions, Madam.
Thank you, and Ms. Witherspoon.
No questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to the board members now for their questions. In the event you are an attendee and would want to pose a question to Ms. Lackner, please reach out through the chat. Madam Chair, do you have questions of Ms. Lackner?
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. I do. Good afternoon, Ms. Lackner. Appreciate your time and your analysis and everything you've shared with the board today. So I wanted to go back to, I think, a statement you made about the social costs of oil and gas and also the methane. For this effort, did you provide or did you do an analysis of what those social costs are?
So yes, I did. I used the current federal estimate of the social cost of methane and applied it to EDF's estimate of methane emissions from oil and gas production in New Mexico for 2019.
And can you just remind me what that cost, what your estimate was?
It's about 1.6 billion.
Okay, and then and that cost, was that using when was that analysis done? I should ask.
So the social cost of methane was updated in I believe, well, spring of 2021 by the interagency working group on the social cost of greenhouse gas emissions to reflect just it's a interim number that reflects inflation since the original analysis was conducted in 2016 or 2017, I believe.
And I just want to make sure I'm clear. And was that done just for New Mexico?
Oh, so the social cost of methane is the value that we rely on at EDF was a number estimated for, it's a global number that reflects global climate damages.
Thank you for that clarification. I just want to make sure I'm doing apples to apples and trying with so much data and assumptions here. So has there been an analysis done just specifically for New Mexico?
So for climate damages, since the damages are global and it's difficult to pinpoint how those damages are impacting people on a local level, we tend to use just a global number. For the VOC damages that I noted, those would be local, although I don't provide an estimate of the magnitude of those damages in my analysis.
Okay. Thank you for that, Ms. Lackner. And then I just want to make sure I clarify. So some of your analysis is only, I think one of your numbers about, trying to calculate apples to apples here with Mr. Dunham's analysis, and you're looking at Mr. Dunham's analysis. And can you remind me what your estimate is for the cost to industry as a result of this, of these rules?
Yes, happy to. I did not provide my own estimate. I did note that if you simply reduce the number of wells, the aggregate cost to industry is quite a bit lower. But again, as others have testified, this doesn't address the per well cost amounts that are also have some questions about those as well.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Lackner. I appreciate your time. That's all for now, Madam Hearing Officer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Vice Chair Trujillo Davis, do you have questions?
I do not at this time. Thank you, Ms. Lackner, for your testimony.
Thank you. Member Cakes?
Yeah, one quick question here, kind of a broad question, and thank you for testifying, Ms. Lackner. So did I hear you say something along the lines of one way to look at this is not as a cost, but perhaps as a capital investment? Did you go there? Did I hear you say something like that?
I'm not sure.
Did your work look at the the waste associated with leaky infrastructure across the Permian, and whether there's any cost or whether there's any capital payback from repairing this leaky system?
Yes. Thank you for clarifying. Yes, I noted that some of these control measures would decrease methane emissions, which would increase revenue for those oil and gas facilities.
Yeah, that's all I had. That's what I thought you said. So I just wanted to make sure. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Member Bitzer?
Did you have a, thank you, by the way, for your testimony. Did you have a job loss estimate of your own, since Dunham's data seems a bit high?
No, that is not something I looked at.
That was my only question, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Member do we have Member Duval? I don't think so. Member Garcia?
No questions. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Member Honker?
No questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see, Ms. Barrios, will there be any redirect?
No need for redirect or rebuttal. Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer.
All right. Well, thank you. And thank you very much, Ms. Lackner, for your testimony. I think we need a break. Shall we break until 3? Yes? All right. Terrific. See you then.